In a dimly lit, warm place filled with alcohol, a gay club, Lee Nam was looking for a decent companion. As he left the venue, he wondered who the most embarrassing person he could run into would be. He thought it might be his boss, who had quickly passed by him, pretending not to know him. What really bothered him was that his boss had left with someone who wasn't him. He remembered that when he was younger, he was an exemplary boy, possibly due to his good upbringing or his appearance. Although his personality was open, he didn't consider himself special. He appreciated that adults saw him as a model student. Lee also mentioned his older brother, who had been a troublemaker in high school. Because of that, he was able to enjoy a life of debauchery without anyone bothering him, as his parents trusted him. However, in the end, they sent him to study abroad for fear that his brother would negatively influence him. He reflected that if his parents hadn't passed away suddenly, he would probably have led a life full of excesses. Despite everything, thanks to his dedication and effort, he became a reliable and capable employee. It had been 6 months since the company transferred him to a hotel where his boss, Jong Vayan, known as a chaebol, held the position of president after completing advanced studies. Lee had accepted the job more out of admiration for Jong than for the salary. In a conversation with Jong, he was asked to prepare coffee. Lee responded affirmatively, stating that his name was Lee Nam. Jong, not remembering his name, expressed a desire to know it and commented that he hoped Lee would be his secretary until the end of his days. Lee jokingly replied that he was willing to be his secretary until death, feeling that it was his calling. However, in his mind, he questioned how the words of a man who would exploit him until the end of his life could be so sweet, acknowledging that it was difficult to be Jong Vayan's assistant. After leaving W.C. Donald's, Lee reflected on his work situation. There were no fixed hours, and he had to adapt to his job like an addict. He would return soon, and he also acted as a driver, as there were no separate functions. Upon seeing Jong, he expressed his envy for the asphalt, wishing he could walk on it too. Jong got into the car, and Lee offered him a hamburger. Jong, surprised, asked if he hadn't had dinner. He extended his hand and said he would eat it, asking about the fries. Lee replied that he had taken them out because he didn't like them. Jong, curious, asked how he knew that. Lee explained that he had noticed it when he sometimes cleaned the trash from the car. Jong reminded him that he didn't have to clean the trash, as the staff took care of that. Lee, with a smile, assured him not to worry, that it was a simple task, and offered him a vanilla latte. In his mind, Lee thought he was simply adapting his work as a secretary to improve his boss's efficiency. Jong, in a serious tone, asked if he had any occupational diseases. Lee, confused, asked him to repeat that. Jong felt that acting kindly was taking up his time. Lee felt his heart shatter at that statement. Jong continued to explain that putting a spoonful of sugar in his coffee every morning, cleaning the car regularly, or placing painkillers on his desk when he hadn't even told him he had a headache seemed unusual to him after meeting in a gay bar. Lee, worried, said that if he thought he was exaggerating, he could tell him. Jong clarified that he was referring to work and that he was there to create a pleasant environment for his boss. Lee, with a smile, suggested that from now on, they would have delicious moments together. The next morning, Lee told the guy that it was 6 o'clock and that it was time to get dressed. The guy, surprised, realized that it was true. Lee thought about the relationship he had with him, an occasional connection that had lasted for several years, a partnership that excluded feelings and only satisfied desires, exactly what he was looking for. Lee asked the guy if he was nice. The guy, confused, asked him to rephrase the question. Lee insisted on knowing if he liked him. The guy, laughing, replied that he wasn't a suitable person to have a relationship with. Lee stated that was the point. The guy asked him to speak in a way he could understand. Lee mentioned that someone had said they wanted to have a relationship with him. The guy encouraged him to go for it, asking what the problem was. Lee explained that it was his boss. The guy, intrigued, asked if he was afraid of retaliation from the company if he refused. Lee wondered what would happen if he fell in love with the president, as he liked him and wanted a relationship similar to the one he had with the guy. Later, in the office, Jong told Lee that he was hungry. Lee offered him coffee and donuts, to which Jong replied, "Sure." Lee thought about how much he liked sweet donuts and fine coffee. Jong thanked Lee, mentioning that he always brought him food when he was hungry and drinks when he was thirsty, asking why they couldn't have a relationship. Lee, nervous, replied that he couldn't do that with his boss, as he was too cute. Zhang suggested that he think of it as part of the job. Lee, with a smile, joked that if the president was his employer, then he would be paid to have a relationship. Zhang, playfully, said he was going crazy at that moment and wondered what he should do. Lee, in his mind, questioned whether he was really going crazy because of Zhang's presence. Zhang insisted that there was no reason not to have a relationship, claiming he was just teasing him. Lee thought that if someone heard what the president was saying, it would sound like something out of a drama, but to him, it sounded like the sweet whisper of the devil. Determined, Zhang told Lee that he wouldn't say he wasn't fond of him and that, therefore, they should have a relationship. Lee, in his mind, reflected on what that meant, wondering if it implied that they would do it whenever Zhang wanted, and then he could look for another partner. Finally, Lee announced that he would close the door and take a shower first. Zhang looked at him with a smile, hinting that the conversation was just beginning. After leaving, Lee, trembling, commented that having a relationship at work was crazy. Zhang, concerned, asked if he was in pain. Lee replied that it had been a long time since he had had a similar experience. Zhang, understanding, said he thought Lee was joking. Lee, still upset, asserted that what had happened was rude. Zhang, with a mischievous smile, apologized, mentioning that his face without glasses was irresistible. Feeling fortunate to see that face, Lee expressed that it was the best. He then asked Zhang to return safely. Zhang told him they would see each other the next day at 6 o'clock at his house. Lee, feeling a mix of emotions, admitted that he couldn't help but like that bastard. The next morning, Lee complained about being tired, even though he had been in the parking lot. It was his first time at Zhang's house, and he wondered why he was so excited. When he rang the doorbell, Zhang opened the door, surprised to see him so soon. Lee commented that he must have been sleeping. Zhang invited him in. Upon entering, Lee noticed that the ceiling height was impressive. Zhang asked if he had slept well, to which Lee replied that he had. Zhang mentioned that he would pay for the taxi fare and, inhaling, commented that it smelled good. Lee, distracted, got lost once again in Zhang's face. Zhang, with a smile, told him that today they would have plenty of time to enjoy their relationship. The next morning, Lee woke up startled, wondering what time it was. When he answered a call, he heard Zhang's voice, who told him he was calling to wake him up and that he had to go to work in the afternoon. Lee, still dazed, accepted the instruction. After hanging up, he told himself it was incredible that Zhang had called just to wake him up. He thought about Zhang Yiyun, a third-generation man from a wealthy family, the only son of the youngest son of President Zhang Pilwan, who was in charge of the hotel business of the Yinhe Group. Despite the controversy surrounding his father's lack of interest in managing the business, Zhang had proven to be a competent man and had quickly resolved any controversies with his successful management. Lee felt like a crazy workaholic as he was on a business trip to Busan over the weekend. Fortunately, the schedule for that day consisted of a quiet meeting for drinks, so he didn't need to accompany Zhang. He thought that room also represented his freedom. Later, Lee checked his agenda and noticed that it started at 10, so he assumed they would go to the hotel pool. Upon arriving, he felt happy to see the place. A girl approached him and asked if he had come alone and if he was there to have fun. Lee replied that he was there for work. The girl, apologizing, expressed that she wanted to go eat with him. Lee, considering the proposal, said that breakfast would be fine and asked if she would like to go together. At that moment, Zhang appeared and called out to Lee. He was surprised to hear his name. Zhang ordered him to come to his room immediately. Lee, somewhat nervous, accepted the order. Zhang, with a smile, commented that he didn't know how to say no to a woman. Lee, trying to stay calm, mentioned that he could also be with the girl. Zhang, amused, reminded him that he thought he felt better doing it in the parking lot. Lee, a bit embarrassed, admitted that he had gotten in Zhang's way. Zhang told him that if it weren't for him, he would already be with the girl. Lee, resigned, stated that he was still satisfied with his relationship with the president. Zhang, laughing, asked what that still meant. Lee, recalling the meeting, reminded him that it was at 10 o'clock. However, Zhang informed him that he had postponed the meeting to tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Lee, surprised, couldn't help but ask why. Jong explained that he had canceled his flight and didn't know when he would return. Lee, resigned, decided that he would take a break that day. However, suddenly, Jong approached and kissed Lee, stating that no, he would be busy. This made both of them get a little spicy, surrendering to each other, wink wink. After several days, Lee reflected on how exceptionally complicated his day had been. It wasn't just due to the lack of sleep. He couldn't concentrate on work because he was constantly thinking about Jong Il-yun and Min Soo-won. He remembered how Jong had left him for Min Soo-won, the mark on his collarbone, and the nail marks on his back, evidence that they had been together. Jong interrupted his thoughts, saying to leave work behind. Lee, obedient, replied, "Yes, boss." In his mind, he thought that Jong's car key was in his pocket and felt excited remembering that he had told him to leave work. He imagined working together. He even knew the password to his house. He knew all of this was because he was his secretary, but that didn't change the fact that he felt more special than anyone else. He wondered how long Jong had been looking at him. Jong, with a smile, told Lee that he was really very handsome. Lee, surprised, thanked him for the compliment. Jong, however, clarified that it wasn't a compliment, but that he would be driving today. Lee, insisting, said it wasn't necessary, that he would do it. Jong, in a playful tone, suggested that they could have a relationship and that they could sleep a little longer since the secretary didn't have to go home so quickly. Lee, in his mind, thought that if it weren't for the security cameras and the elevator door opening just at that moment, he would have kissed Jong. The tension in the air was palpable, and Lee felt trapped between his feelings and the reality of his situation. At that moment, Min Soo-won appeared, a blond boy with a feminine air, calling out to Jong. In a complaining tone, he asked why Jong was ignoring his calls. Jong, with a serious look, reminded him that they were at the company. Min Soo-won insisted that he couldn't just ignore his calls because he was at work, questioning whether he would get in trouble for using his phone, and reminded him that he was the boss. Jong, maintaining his composure, told him that he didn't have time to respond to each of his frivolities and asked how many problems he thought he would cause him in front of an employee. Min Soo-won, in a pleading tone, told him that he had left him that way. Jong, firm, asked him to stop. Lee, observing the scene, thought it was surprising how cold Jong could be, even making him feel bad. Min Soo-won, with a tone of sadness, mentioned that he hadn't had dinner yet. Lee, in his mind, reflected that Min Soo-won was also a strong rival. He noticed that, on the verge of tears, he changed his strategy to look pitiful, wondering if he would really do it. If Jong left him like he had left Lee, he would feel devastated. Jong, interrupting his thoughts, said that he had a date. Min Soo-won, desperate, reminded him that he was hungry and had no money. Jong, unfazed, suggested that he order room service and eat, assuring him that he wouldn't ask him to pay it back. Min Soo-won, insisting, told him that he had come to Korea after a long time and that they couldn't have dinner together. Jong, remembering that he had already had dinner with him despite having a date, explained that this was a restricted area for visitors and asked him not to follow him. Lee, observing the interaction, felt confused. He should have felt relieved, but he didn't. He thought that if Min Soo-won hadn't been able to win Jong's love, maybe he wouldn't be able to either. He realized that Min Soo-won had confronted Jong directly and had been rejected. It was out of fear of rejection that he hid his own feelings. If he couldn't hide them and confessed, things could get complicated. Jong, tired, commented that it wasn't like he didn't know that Min Soo-won liked him. Lee, feeling uncomfortable, suggested that maybe Min Soo-won shouldn't have gotten involved with him and apologized for being impertinent. Jong, in a softer tone, asked for the car key. Lee, determined, refused, saying that he would go. Jong, concerned, told him that he didn't want him to have an accident. In response, Lee felt he had no choice but to give it to him. Jong, relieved, asked what they should eat now that they were out. He suggested donuts, to which Lee replied that it would be heavy to eat that at night. Jong, with a smile, proposed fried tteokbokki. Lee, surprised, thought it was funny to imagine Jong Il-yun eating that kind of food, but he couldn't help but smile at the idea that it would be a little amusing. Regarding your question, tteokbokki is actually a popular Korean street food made from chewy rice cakes, tteok, and typically served in a spicy sauce, often with fish cakes and vegetables. It's quite different from a hot dog. Lee was worried about the impertinence he had shown, so he was thinking about going home. Fortunately, Jang Yi-yun didn't pay much attention to it. He was like a child, cute and cruel at the same time, and Lee felt like a dragonfly in that child's hand. Despite that, he liked him. He enjoyed observing him closely because he wanted to make sure he was really okay, and there was only one way that would allow him to do that. Lee told Jang that he would eat whatever he wanted. Jang, nodding, replied that he would be quick. Upon arriving, Lee thanked Jang for bringing him food and asked him to return safely. Jang, saying goodbye, told him they would see each other tomorrow. Later, at a bar, Lee reflected on his situation. He knew very well what he was to Jang Yi-yun. To him, he was just a convenient partner for a relationship. He wondered if he really needed to confirm it that way. He wasn't at Jang Yi-yun's house, and reproached himself for not having held on to him and sincerely telling him that he wanted to have a relationship. He thought that if he had done that, Jang would have realized his feelings. At that moment, Seo, Lee's friend, arrived, surprising him by asking if he was crazy. Lee, frustrated, replied that it was all his fault. Seo reminded him that it was Lee who hung up the phone and had suddenly asked him to come. He then noticed that Lee's eyes looked strange and asked if he had been crying. Lee, in his mind, remembered the warm touch of Seo Jo, which made him think of the person he had been trying to forget with alcohol. He thought of Jang Yi-yun, who had driven in his place because he didn't want him to have an accident and had told him to sleep at his house, making him believe he was being affectionate. Now he realized that he was just trying to make him feel a little better. Seo, touching Lee's hair, told him that he was very patient. Lee, jokingly, asked if he was his brother. Seo, determined, told him it was time to go home. Lee, with a mischievous smile, replied that they were going to have a relationship. Seo, surprised, looked at him and told him he was crazy. Lee was lost in his thoughts, questioning what everything that had happened meant. He wondered if it had been a misunderstanding and reflected on his situation. There were moments when he thought it wasn't so bad to stay as he was, but sometimes he questioned whether he should take the risk. Although it sometimes hurt, maybe he should just get used to it and move on. However, he couldn't bear the pain. He didn't like that Jang Vi-yun was dating other people, and it was even worse that he encouraged him to do the same. He feared that if it continued like this, he would end up going crazy. In the midst of his thoughts, his phone rang, but he kept reflecting. He didn't know if he should expect anything from Jang, and wondered why he should care if he didn't expect anything from him. When he answered the call, he said, "Hello." Jang, on the other end, asked if he was sleeping. Lee quickly replied that no, he was already awake. Jang asked if he was at home, to which Lee confirmed that he was. Then, Jang asked if he had seen his message. Lee, worried, asked if there was a problem at the company. Jang told him no, to forget about that, and asked him to come out for a moment, mentioning that he heard the doorbell and asked him to open the door. When Lee opened the door, he was surprised to see Jang. "Mr. President," he exclaimed. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Jang Yi-yun was wearing jeans and had come to his house dressed like that. "Oh my God!" Lee thought, astonished. Jang asked if he was alone, and Lee replied that he was. Jang, with a smile, asked if he had eaten, mentioning that he had bought porridge and had brought a lot. Lee, feeling a bit overwhelmed, told him that his brother was at home. In his mind, Lee kept repeating that he was going to go crazy. He wondered what kind of boss went to his 6 secretaries' house bringing porridge. Finally, he told Jang that he was going to eat it. Jang, with a curious look, asked if he wouldn't invite him in. Lee, stunned, thought to himself that Jang Yi-yun was in his house. He couldn't believe it. He had really come because he was worried about his absence due to his illness. He wondered what was going on with Jang, if he missed him. He knew he shouldn't expect anything from him, but he couldn't help but feel hopeful. Of course, there could be other reasons besides concern. He told himself that Jang desired him and that he couldn't reject him. His heart raced as he looked into those black eyes filled with desire, and he felt very happy that that desire was directed towards him. How could he reject that person? Both entered the house, and what happened was that Jang seduced Lee, leading them to an intimate moment when suddenly Lee's older brother walked in. Surprised, he told his brother to wait. assuring him that what was happening was not what he thought. Lee, nervous, insisted that it wasn't what it looked like. In his mind, he wondered what to do, whether his brother would be very angry or surprised. Even though he was his older brother, the situation made him anxious. The brother, with a teasing smile, mentioned the lover that Lee had been suffering over these days. He advised him to give it his best shot and let in a little air, reminding him that he should use protection. Later, in the office, Lee felt overwhelmed by what had happened. He thought that they had really crossed a line this time and felt as if he were dying. At that moment, he saw a notification on his phone from Louis Vuitton saying that he could wear a simple bracelet, a gift that Jong Eun had bought for him. He wondered what reaction he should have when Jong gave it to him. He thought about whether he should look happy, pretend he didn't know anything, or act as if he still had internal issues so that Jong would worry and try to win his heart. He wished that this confusion would pass soon. Suddenly, he received a message from Jay saying that he was going out with the guys the next day and that Lee should go too. Lee, relieved, thought it was better to have other people around rather than being alone with Jong. Lee replied that he would see how he felt after finishing his work and that he would go if he could, although he knew he might not be able to. Jay reminded him that it had been a long time since they had met and asked him to make sure to go. Then, Lee turned to Jong, calling him president. Jong, concerned, asked if he was feeling okay. Lee assured him that he was fine. Jong, noticing that Lee had fallen asleep like a little chick, told him he could leave early that day because he had a family meeting. He had specifically asked him not to schedule anything in his itinerary because of that. Lee, confirming that Jong would take the car, said he would come directly to the company the next day. Jong asked him to rest a bit today. In his mind, Lee wondered if it was okay to kiss him and wish him a good dinner. Jong, saying goodbye, asked him to take care. Lee, worried, thought he didn't know if something bad had happened at the family meeting yesterday. It seemed like it had gone south, and that the group had not approved the hotel acquisition investment. Although the situation with Hotel Nova was good at that time, the acquisition funds were so high that they were completely on a new level. Lee told Jong that he seemed to have a headache. Jong appreciated the comment. Lee, concerned, asked if he should cancel today's itinerary. Jong, in a tired tone, replied that he couldn't even take a break. Since that morning had been so disastrous, he hoped they would come back with new ideas that afternoon. Lee, in his mind, was only worried about Jong Eun's well-being. Jong sincerely confessed that he had no interest in becoming the owner of that group, but it bothered him that they kept doubting and reviewing everything. It also made him uncomfortable that they kept talking about marriage. Lee, surprised, asked if they didn't know about his orientation. Jong explained that the people who knew him were aware, but those who didn't were not. He didn't expect people who paid too much attention to what he did to know about his personal life. However, those things were not of great importance to those people. They believed that people should get married even if they got involved in complicated relationships. Lee reflected that this was how it was. In his mind, he thought that Jong Eun's idea of getting married someday, just for the sake of marriage, made him feel that all his suffering was completely in vain. Jong, surprised, commented that it was strange and that he couldn't believe he was saying such things. At that moment, Jong took Lee by the arm and kissed him, whispering in his ear that it seemed he was becoming addicted to it. Despite being angry and having many things on his mind, he could only see how handsome Secretary Lee was. Lee, with a smile, replied that he already knew he was a big fan of his face. Jong, playfully, asked him to have some of his ice cream, winking at him. After Lee tried Jong's ice cream, he suggested that they should leave work on time that day. Jong agreed, saying it sounded good and that they should leave on time. Seeing Jong Eun's face, which had become much more relaxed than before, made Lee happy. He thought that Jong liked him in the same way he liked Jong. Later, Lee was sitting at his desk when a guy arrived. It was Minsu, who asked if Jong Eun was in his office and said he was going to go in. Lee, worried, told him that he couldn't just walk in like that. At that moment, he noticed the bracelet Minsu was wearing, and just then, Jong told Lee to get back to work. Lee nodded and started typing on his computer. While writing an email, he mentioned that Secretary Park had delivered the bracelet she bought for the president during one of her recent errands. Secretary Park replied that yes, the night before, the president had asked her to give it to the guest who was staying at one of the hotels. Lee, in his mind, thought that he knew he shouldn't be checking those things, but he couldn't resist. That night, while driving, Lee thought to himself that he was an idiot for believing that Jong Eun liked him. He convinced himself that he would give the bracelet to someone he loved, but now he felt pathetic for still having false hopes. He remembered how Jong treated him and thought that he liked him, but a single moment had shattered that conviction. He felt angry every time he imagined what could have happened during the hour Jong spent with Min Seo-won, but he knew he had no right to be angry. Upon arriving, Lee told Jong that they were there. Jong asked him if he wasn't going to come in with him. Lee, trying to maintain his composure, wished him good night and said he should get some rest. Jong replied that he would definitely sleep better if Lee went with him, although it could also be that he was tired. Lee, in a serious tone, clarified that it wasn't that. In his mind, he wondered how nice it would have been if his wishes were guided by Jong's love for him. Lee told Jong that he had a prior commitment and that he would pick him up in the morning. Jong, saying goodbye, told him he would see him tomorrow. In his mind, Lee reflected on how he had once been determined to let himself be carried away by Jong because he didn't believe he would lose him. However, now he didn't have the strength to face Jong Eun. Jong called him again, and Lee responded with President. Jong reiterated that he would see him tomorrow. While driving, Lee thought that he knew he should stop looking for reasons behind Jong's actions. His hesitation confused him, and it was difficult for him to suppress his desires to cling to him. He had made excuses before, but now he felt lonely and knew he would only get depressed if he stayed like this, so he decided to go to the meeting. He remembered that those were the same guys he used to hang out with in school when he met Jo. They had known each other for a long time and had ended up being friends after sharing intimate moments. Talking about his own issues as if they were someone else's, he felt that things became less painful. He assumed that someone who knew him would be surprised, as he had never expressed that he loved anyone, even though he felt strange for having those feelings, especially for an unrequited love. He still didn't understand why Jong Eun treated him as if he were his lover. He didn't like it, so he didn't understand why he could be so sweet. He also wondered why he had given that bracelet to Min Seo-won. It was a birthday gift for someone he was familiar with. He would feel better if he could tell those idiots everything, and maybe they would console or cheer him up. Finally, he thought that, first of all, Jong Eun was 100% on the other side. He was definitely not hetero.